Hello, I'm an organism. Okay, that's about, yeah. No, I think that's why I was asked to talk. Yeah, 15 minutes of algebraic topology is very hard to give you a feeling for the subject, okay? So I tried to think about what would be useful as opposed to, because, and I'm not sure. What I hope is to sort of give you a gist of the way algebraic topologists think a little bit, so that there's a chance that you might at some point think that they might not be useless, and then you might go talk to one of them, and if you're lucky, you'll talk to one who's useful. Okay, I mean, there's no guarantee. Okay, right? Even but you do your best. Okay, so algebraic topology is about using algebra to understand spaces and the maps between them. Okay, so firstly, you have to get used to what a space is. You want to get into the drift of seeing spaces everywhere. Okay, and by the way, and then the question is, what is algebra? Okay, which unfortunately, if I had 15 minutes, I could explain to you what algebra is also. I mean, why not do another few centuries of math all compressed into one? So there are lots and lots of different algebraic structures. You're probably familiar with modular arithmetic, for example, as a variant of numbers. There are complex numbers, right? There are quaternions, there are matrices, right? There are lots and lots of different algebraic structures. Some of them are commutative, some are not commutative, right? Plethora of things. Algebraic topologists love all of those because everyone likes having more and more tools, okay? But I'm not going to talk to you about the algebra that they use. I'm going to keep all of that vague, okay? So the kind of thing that it relates to are kind of qualitative problems. People are used to, say, topologists not knowing the difference between a donut and a coffee cup or something like that, right? So what can they tell, right? If they can't tell the difference between those things, right? Right, so there's something, they're trying to capture the qualitative aspects of spaces, whatever those are, okay? So one kind of thing that was a great discovery of the early 20th century is the notion of dimension, okay? So for vector spaces, you know exactly what dimension means. That's a question about how many parameters do you need to describe a vector. If you're in a nonlinear situation, then, where you could combine things in any which way, then, is it really clear that the things that need 3 dimensions and the things that need 2 dimensions are really different than each other? So with this wrong definitions, Peano gave what are called space-filling curves, right? There's all these pathologies that mathematicians love, but in the end, there is some kind of coherent definition of dimension. Whether it's relevant to some kind of noisy problem or not, that's a different problem. So, for example, geometers, and by the way, I do not want to distinguish between geometry and topology, although there are ideologues who will make very clear, useless to make a distinction. Okay, but so there is a question: if I have something or other, what dimension to assign to it? So there are people who study a thing called Urisan width. So you have something or other where from one scale it looks 2-dimensional, if you look at it really closely, it looks 3-dimensional. So what sort of is the closest 2-dimensional approximation you could have to it? Okay, so talk to a topologist, he'll say the dimension is the first thing you want to know, but then if you talk to, don't take that as the last word. So topology is more than a graph. Lots of times people say we want to study the topology of a situation, and they mean a graph or a network or something like that. It's true, but it also is, higher dimensional things. Topologists use the word homology a lot, and it might not be what you think, okay? Another warning is that topologists talk about cell complexes. I thought I was going to be preceded by a talk about cell complexes. We also mean different things by it. So there are communication problems. Our cell complexes aren't alive, and I'll leave out the next snarky slide. Okay, there are tons and tons of biological networks, okay, which we've already seen in the previous talk. This is a great historical, one of the early tree of life pictures. More networks, very cool. Okay, then there are the landscapes. Who can resist landscapes? Okay, and this is And I can't believe that I didn't quite ever see. This is the historical Waddington landscape. I don't know how many times I've seen it in this room over the past couple of years. Okay, this one, I don't know if this is actually a picture of Galton. Galton was a eugenicist, but he was also a very famous statistician, the creator of branching processes, for example. Yeah, significant guy. He was a cousin or something of Darwin, and he had a theory of evolution where he had some kind of polytope. And this is a picture from his book where he had his theory of evolution with the idea that there are going to be stable states, etc. So I think the moral is that everyone really wants to be a geometer, okay? No, so that there are these geometric metaphors that occur all the time, okay? And the point of topology is to go ahead and be able to reason about these metaphors, okay? Right, so what do we mean by dimension, right? What are the notions of connectedness, okay? Things like that. So what I want to explain is that spaces are everywhere. There are measurements we can make of them, right? So the easiest one is, just how many components we have, okay, right? So if you're talking about a population, it's just the number of people in the population, okay? But another thing that you might study where it's less obvious is, you take a tissue sample and then you're looking at various subpopulations of cells of different kinds. And so that's one kind of thing. But then a topologist will say, oh, well, you should really, have many, many samples and observe how that's evolving over time and try to get information that's coming out of that. Okay? So topology is at least a set of adjectives. Okay? These are stable. Okay, so that's sort of an important feature, right? I mean, you can do all sorts of measurements, but if the thing that you measure from a tissue sample is the number of cells, that's not a useful thing to know. I mean, on its own, right? And if it's going to be off by 3 or 4, who really cares, right? I mean, you want to study things where you could go ahead and understand the impact of noise. Okay, so topology is really useful for studying stability. And besides studying the spaces themselves, okay, an additional thing that occurs, and this was occurring as a large part of the theme of the last time, is that not only do you study networks, you want to study processes occurring on networks. Well, the same thing is true for spaces more generally. Okay, you have something or other that takes place on a space. Okay, so you imagine that you have some motion. So if I'm on a circle, I can constantly move an inch to my left. Okay, and then I will come back to where I started. If I were on an interval, there's no way for me to have some process that doesn't have a stable equilibrium somewhere. Okay, so the geometry of the space impacts what are the processes that can take place on that. And topology, that's one of the things that topology traditionally studies. Okay, so this is sort of a favorite example of mine for a few reasons. And this is pointillism, where the theme of pointillism is that you just draw dots. Okay, and then the mind puts together and it sees a higher dimensional object that really has structure. Okay, so if you're going to be a purely ideological topologist and you see dots, all you have are dots. Okay, that's all there is. Okay, but then, you should go and drop further, introduce scale, introduce a little bit of the geometry about how close dots are to each other. Okay, so that's why I say it's not really good to just maintain the definitions. You have to mix the topology and the geometry. With the geometry, you could try to say, oh, well, there's a tree there, there's a sailboat, and so on and so forth, right? So there are tools that go between the discrete and the continuous, okay? So now let me just give you some spaces, okay? Just so that you see them everywhere, okay? Okay, good. Okay, the circle, everyone knows the circle. Okay. Okay. I hope, right? Okay. Jokes are being suppressed at the moment. Okay, this the topologist will call the two-dimensional sphere. okay? It's very important, right? This is going to be your first moment where you're going to say topologists are crazy because this sits inside of three-dimensional space, right? But we don't care where it sits. We sit in it, right? We're living on the surface of the sphere. We think we're living in a two-dimensional situation, right? So from its internal point of view, it thinks it's two-dimensional. Okay, so the topologist just doesn't really care. Now, what would be another space that a topologist might introduce? What's called the projective plane. Okay, the projective plane would be, like how might I be led to a circle? Well, I really live on the real line, but I discover that every 24 hours, my internal structure is doing the same thing. So in that case, time, as far as my internal structure is concerned, is really a circle. So the circle emerges as the space in which time is arising. Suppose that I had some physical phenomenon on the surface of the Earth where antipodal points always behave the same. Okay, so then the topologist would say, well, don't consider this space as the sphere with an extra symmetry. It would just say, fold it all together. And then the space that you would get, it would look like the famous Mobius strip. Okay, now the boundary of this Mobius strip is, if you look at it, it's just one circle. And then you would be gluing a disk along the boundary to that circle. Now, when you do this, you went from a space which you have no trouble visualizing to a space that doesn't actually fit inside three-dimensional Euclidean space. No trouble to conceptualize it, to think about what it would be like to live on that space, anything you want to do, but you build abstract spaces, for example, out of symmetries. Okay. Another thing I might consider pairs of points on the circle. Okay, so if I keep track of the order of that pair, that's the same thing as having a point on the surface of a torus, on the surface of a bagel, okay, which is also a coffee cup. Okay, if I don't care about what these two things are, then what I actually get is the Mobius strip. When you form that, and this boundary circle corresponds to the points where the particles collide. Okay, I was supposed to give some other example, but who cares what I was planning to do? Okay, another place where spaces occur are solutions to equations. Okay, right? We're all familiar with that. We learned how to graph things. So that's sort of a source. If you look at the equation y cubed equals x squared, it looks like this cusp curve. So you see something in the geometry. If you do this with complex numbers, it becomes much more interesting. At that singular point, okay, firstly, if you have two complex numbers, that's going to be a four-dimensional space, right? How would you begin thinking about that? Well, I might think about what is the intersection with concentric spheres, right? So those spheres are three-dimensional spheres. Okay, if I have a three-dimensional sphere, how am I going to think about that? That sits in four-dimensional space. Throw away one point and spread it out, and then you're in this room. We live in essentially a three-dimensional sphere in this room, ignoring if we make all the boundary infinitely far away. Okay, so we could then picture it, and then that locus looks like the trefoil knot. Okay, so the other way topologists, here's an example. Suppose I think about, I have two proteins, and they're in some mixture. So then there's an interval where I just say, this is protein 1, this is protein 2, and this is the point xp1 plus 1 minus x p2. Okay, suppose I have three proteins, but only two of them are ever occurring at the same time. Well, then I have p3, and I have to be on one of these edges. Suppose that actually all three could occur. Well, then I have the whole thing filled in. Suppose that I know that I never managed to get a third. P3 never gets to be more than a third of it. Well, so then I would get something that's sort of a thickened triangle, but it doesn't fill in the hole. Okay, topologists would call this a homotopy. Okay, so from some points of view, there's still a hole in the space. Okay, so this, and by the way, this is what people call first homology. Okay, zero homology is the number of components. Okay, but then you could ask about one-dimensional holes, right? You think about things as being in two components as being I have something one place, something somewhere else, and then there's a missing path to connect them. Okay, so from that point of view, here I have a closed loop, and I'm missing some kind of disk that would fill it in. Okay, so we really, of course, count the things that are there, which are the curves. Okay, I mean, it sounds funny to say that I'm counting the missing disks because they're not there, and how many disks are you missing? Okay, it's a sort of meaningless question. Okay, if I had 4 proteins, okay, then I would be having this. Okay, if I would have all combinations of 3, it would then be the boundary of a tetrahedron. If I have all 4 possibilities, okay, then it would be the solid 3-dimensional thing. Okay, so you can now begin imagining you have very, very complicated things that could be mixtures in many ways, and then all of a sudden, this is a source of countless spaces that could be describing your situation. Okay, so now here's a bad model of gene expression. Okay, but just to give you the way a topologist would think about it, because I happen to know a topologist who thought about things this way. Okay, so you have a gene, and of course it's a discrete thing, but you know, like we just said, discrete, continuous, we're friends. Okay, so now it always starts off with telomeres, right? They don't do anything at the beginning, so you're always right. So what's your feeling as you're moving around the gene? Right, I'm trying to get you to live in whatever space you want to think about. Okay, that's the goal. Right, so I want to think about gene expression space. So at each point, you know, at one point here, nothing is being expressed. Right, so I have to look at a neighborhood of it, and then there's some kind of possibility. Each thing, depending on the size of this neighborhood, there'll be some amount of proteins that it would be building in some percentages. And I know I'm oversimplifying enormously. I said this is a bullshit model, okay? And I'm not going to say it's useful for anything either, okay? But you start off always at the same place, which is telomeres. Okay, you begin moving, and as you move, you know, where you are in this space of mixtures is moving around. Okay, so you're given, so as you go here, you're having, at each point, you're getting a value in something. That's what mathematicians call a function. So it's now a function from the interval, you know, that goes into some space, some local expression space, and then it ends up, again, with telomeres. So it's a round trip. So I can think of that as a function from the circle into this space. All of a sudden, to the topologist, you know, this concrete thing has now become a point in an infinite dimensional space. So firstly, function spaces have been popular in topology since close to the beginning of the subject. Okay, and this might seem awful to you. Why would you think you're going to benefit from studying something concrete and beautiful that you could look at, like a tetrahedron, and then instead replace it by some infinite dimensional object? Okay, well, I want to point out that's actually what occurs all the time in biology. You look at familiar things like organisms, and you say that's the wrong level of studying it. Right? I'm going to instead study some things that are really unfamiliar to our experience. Right? So I might study biochemistry and break things down to their atoms and how they're assembled with each other. So topologists do the same thing. They will study like a 2-dimensional sphere by approximating it by a sequence of spaces, all of which are infinite dimensional, but have some other advantage as far as analysis is concerned. You don't need to know that. Okay? But you should not be scared of an infinite dimensional space occurring within your modeling. Okay? The infinite dimensional space might be easier than the finite dimensional space, and might occur within when the analysis the topologist does. Anyway, so you could imagine embeddings of a curve, and that leads you to knot theory, etc. Okay, I've lost track of time, so which is a bad thing. So
I think if you wrap up in 3 or 4 minutes,
then okay, then that's what I will do. Okay, good. So I want to emphasize their stability. So one form of stability is the fact that that this wacky circle and the triangle, they're the same thing to each other to a topologist. Knowing the exact position of your items isn't important. So it has a built-in stability into its notions. Okay, here's another stability. Suppose I was thinking about maps from the circle to itself. Okay, right. So at each point in the circle, I have another circular value. Okay, and suppose that my memory isn't so good. So here it's like the identity map. After a little while, I begin drawing it. Now it looks something like that. Okay, but no point gets moved more than pi radians, or I don't know what, less than, you're always moving less than 180 degrees. Okay, so now if I do that for a few seconds, you feel like you could be anywhere, right? Any point, any particular point after such an evolution could end up anywhere. But the fact that all of these things were forced to be moved essentially coherently actually means that the number of times this goes around stays the same. Okay, okay. You can't turn this into that, okay, and that's a little exercise. Okay, so topology enables you to say, okay, the values of the function are unstable because I keep doing a lot of measurements. There's going to be some time evolution going on. But what are the things that will stay the same in this system? Okay, well, topologists, that's what we're there for. Okay, that's sort of the problem. Okay, I think that if my time is up, I'll stop here because more is worse. You'll forget it. Okay.
We have time for some questions. Yes, you're going to raise your hand. Yes.
So when you mention stability, right?
Yes.
On my stability,
Uh-huh.
there is some. What's the relationship?
Okay. Good. Okay. We love our coffee. We love our bagels. Okay. So I'm imagining a torus. Okay. And here I'm thinking about the height as a function on the torus. And I want to consider the gradient of height. Okay. So I could then have a differential equation, right? X is all the variables, this is minus the gradient. Okay. So it will be pushing downward. Okay. In fact, let me make it a sort of an uglier torus. Okay. Topologically, it's the same. A torus with warts is still a torus. Okay. So what happens? What's going on in this? So as as in the last lecture and in your lecture, you have to look at the critical points. Where is the gradient 0? Okay. So here are where the gradient is 0. You identify these points. Okay. And then you count how many eigenvalues are positive and how many are negative. Okay. So these are critical, and the number that are negative are the topologists call the index. Okay. So here, these are index 0, they're local minima. These are stable equilibria, okay, for the system. Okay. Now, all of these others are equilibria. Okay. You would never see them directly because they're unstable equilibria. Okay. You might see them if there's a symmetry in the system, right? And then that might force, the symmetry would then change this to be with respect to the symmetry, another story. But without symmetry, you would never see this, and you would never see this one. On the other hand, if there's some stochasticity, right? So then so if there's a little bit of stochasticity, you'll end up near your equilibrium and then flow back into it. But if it's, but there are the rare events, or depending on things, this critical point of index 1 would be inferred. Okay, and that would be always present, or almost always with high probability, when you transition from here to there. Now, what topology would tell you immediately, before you do anything fancy, is that when you're on a torus, you're always entitled to one local minimum. Okay, it would also tell you that if you have 2 local minimum, there has to be some critical point of index 1, but we know what that is. That would be sort of the typical thing, where it would be transitioning. Okay, so it would be telling you such relations. So this is a thing called Moore theory. Another thing that it would be telling you is, what tends to happen in these kind of things is that most of the time you're at the thing with least energy. Okay, but now you can ask, how much time does it take to transition from one to the other? Okay, so that will be determined by how high this is. Now, this function here might be your fitness function in an evolutionary situation. Suppose you perturb the fitness function a little bit. So what might happen is, well, firstly, topology will say, if you only perturb the function a certain amount, the bottom is going to have to be nearby. However, it will warn you that you don't know where in the original space the bottom will be. So this thing here that used to be the less common species, okay, there will be another species that's approximately as energetically successful, but it might be a different one. Okay, how much time would it take to do that transition? That will be related to where that critical point of index 1 is. Okay, so that's the kind of thing which, the kind of reasoning that would be part of, sort of mixing, a first class in Langevin dynamics with Morse theory. Okay, kind of thing. So I don't know if I answered your question. I answered a question I wanted to. Okay, which is maybe a lesson in talking to topologists.
Thank you.
Any other questions? If not, let's thank Schmuel one more time.